Second reading is the gospel lesson from Matthew 25, beginning at verse 14. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusting his property to them, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another one 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. The one who received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of these slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. The one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I've made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seeds. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him. Give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have in abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is the gospel of the Lord. The traditional and practically universal read on this passage is that we will face a reckoning as Christ's disciples for how we use what we've been given. Every skill we have, every dime in our savings and accounts, every second of our day, we understand is a gift from God. God will ask us what we have done with all of that. This thinking runs so strongly through our Western Christian culture that the word talent comes to us from this parable. There's a man in our parable of today, of course, who is wealthy, and he takes a trip. A talent is worth about 15 years of a day laborer's wage in this time. In today's terms, given the current federal minimum wage, that works out to about $225,000, which is what the last slave received. The first slave received over $1 million in today's terms, and the second one would have gotten a little less than $500,000. And those numbers don't, of course, approach the super wealthy of our day, but I think if Jesus was retelling the story, he would likely have added a few zeros onto the figures. Richard Rohrbaugh, who is a religious studies professor at Lewis and Clark, disagrees with the traditional view. He contends that in the ancient world, the rich were mostly seen as thieves and morally bankrupt by religious leaders. Economics of the time were seen as a zero-sum game. Wealth was not created. It was pulled out of the ground via things like mining projects or massive agricultural projects. The labor for these endeavors were supplied by slaves or the poor. So the wealthy took away another person's just share of the resources. And an early Christian writer named Jerome is quoted as saying, "Every rich person is either a thief or the heir of a thief." Another writer, Sirach, says, a rich man will exploit you if he can, and if you can be of use to him. But if you are in need, he will forsake you. And supposedly, Rohrbaugh says the rich tried to avoid these charges by having their slaves manage the estates. The slaves were expected to make the decisions that took advantage of others, and the owners could maintain it wasn't their fault. It was these greedy slaves making these choices. So Rohrbaugh sees this story as mostly about exploitation. You know, one other piece on all of this complicated parable that challenges us in our thinking is the slave who had the one talent did what was considerable a dishonorable thing for the time. He didn't use the talent to exploit others, that's true. But instead he invested it with the bankers, or even investing it with the bankers. He didn't do that either. He buried it. Now, burying treasure was understood as one way to guard it in the ancient world. You hid it. So when Jesus tells another parable about a man finding a treasure in a field, he's stumbling across somebody else's money, is what he's doing at that point. Loaning money at interest was forbidden by Jewish law. So the owner's admonition that the slave could have invested with the bankers was a direction to disobey Jewish law. Eusebius, another early church writer, quotes a version of this parable from a lost gospel called the Gospel of the Nazareans. And in this version of the story, the man with one talent is actually called a hero because he didn't do anything bad with his money. Of course, Rohrbaugh's argument has problems. In this context, in Matthew, the rich landowner often represents God in this series of parables that Jesus tells. Even if landowners were largely unjust individuals at the time, Jesus seems to love picking unlikely individuals to play the positive role. Witness the story of the Good Samaritan. Samaritans were looked down on, and yet Jesus made the Samaritan the hero in the parable we've come to know as the Good Samaritan. You know, and Rohrbaugh doesn't care for the harshness of the owner at the end of the parable, as probably do most of us dislike it. But another commentator, Mark Douglas, points out that part of the lesson is we may well meet the God we expect to meet. The first slave is the one who judges the owner as harsh and stingy, ignoring the fact that the owner has given him a very generous amount of money. If we see God as harsh, judgmental, and small-minded, perhaps we will find we are actually serving that God instead of the true God. We can learn some things, I think, from Rohrbaugh's interpretation, even though I don't agree with it. He is absolutely correct about one thing that's important to remember. Money and justice are linked. Christian and Hebrew scriptures teach that how we use our money is going to be judged by God against standards of justice. The only measure isn't increase. It's whether we're taking all this money and skills and privilege or anything else that we have and using it in a way that blesses others. Witness the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. You know, the rich man spent his entire life ignoring the plight of this poor man Lazarus on his doorstep. And his outcome was damnation. A major clue for us that this parable is more than money is that there are these extravagant, outrageous sums involved. None of the common folks that heard Jesus preach this would have that kind of money. And likely none of the slaves in the crowd would ever have been entrusted with that much wealth to manage. Who would be that generous and trusting? Well, the gracious Father that Jesus spoke to the crowds about would be that generous. God practices incredible generosity with the monies and skills and abilities that we enjoy. God gives us huge blessings. What other deeper lessons can we find here? One lesson is the issue of privileges we enjoy. You know, we can name a lot of privileges that different people enjoy in our culture, right? Children whose parents work hard at maintaining stability certainly have advantages. People who grow up in school districts with good education have advantages. Families with means who give children extra education and recreation, they have advantages. Children who grew up in homes without violence or in safe neighborhoods, they enjoy advantages. Children with healthy DNA and particular talents and skills that flow from that DNA have advantages. There are plenty of other things we can see as being advantages. And we shouldn't feel any sense of guilt about our advantages. That's not the point. The two slaves with much weren't expected to feel guilty or ashamed about what they'd been given. Many of the advantages that we enjoy in life are pure gift. They flow to us from God because of culture or the work of our parents or the work of teachers and tutors or coaches. These gifts, these parables teach us that this parable teaches us come with responsibilities. We have advantages, and every person does. What will we do with them? Our gifts, our skills, our resources should bring blessings to the communities in which we live. At least the investment with the banker that the third slave could have done represents the bare minimum we should be doing. The ideal model are the two slaves with so much. They poured their talents into much riskier but much more fruitful projects. One of the surprising truths we may discover in this parable is this: we're expected to risk extravagantly with the gifts we've been given. And this connects well with this discussion we've had about stewardship. Generous living does involve risk. To be generous is to open up our lives in all sorts of ways. This means risking our privileges, our reputations, our money, our talents, our skills for the sake of others. As with risky financial investments, sometimes it will cause significant blessings. And sometimes our efforts may seem to be for naught or even put us personally at risk. But this kind of living over the course of our lives is cherished by God and will produce fruit. The series of parables in Matthew 25 that Jesus is telling here speaks to a grand moment of judgment that Jesus says will come. But we encounter moments of judgment throughout our lives. There is grace and warning in that. Jesus' words about entrusting more to those with much and taking away from others is a reminder that we're given blessings again and again and again in our lives. And the more we receive, the more we're expected to use those to bless others. If we fail to do that with new blessings, those blessings and much more may be taken away. The task, the challenge, is to be more like those first two slaves. And it might seem overwhelming to us. But there's a couple of lessons we can learn from that. We must learn to live in ways that deal with fear. All of us encounter things that are going to make us afraid. What we must avoid is living like the third slave who was controlled by his fears. The first two slaves realized that they could take risks despite their fears for the sake of multiplying their shares, and it would be pleasing to their master. A willingness to take that kind of risk means trusting in God. When we realize all that we have is pure gift, it frees us from the fear of loss that can plague us. God has given us all the blessings we enjoy, and God wants to give us plenty more. Our responsibility is to take all He has given us and pour it into the lives of others and offer them blessing. And that's a day-by-day task of naming our fears and asking God for courage and risking for the sake of the kingdom. Second step, I would say, is something you can practice this week. Now, a lot of Thanksgivings, families will gather and they'll go around the table and they'll recount their blessings, things that they're thankful for. I can invite you to extend that practice a little bit. So, of course, first question, what are you thankful for that you have received as a gift? Second, more difficult question, how have you or how will you use that to bless others? And think about some creative ways then that you can use those gifts to bless others. And rather than just being a short, self-centered exercise before we eat, this Thanksgiving moment may give you a plan of action, something to go out in the world to do justice, to seek justice, or to bring kindness into the life of another person. A third consideration about this whole parable on talents, I had my eyes open to a whole new way of looking at it this week. I sometimes am able to attend a minister's study that I go to where we talk about the particular passages of the week that people will be preaching on. And we were discussing this passage, and the issue of generosity, of course, arose. And one minister talked about how he had married a woman who was much more generous than he was. She had not had an easy childhood. She had experienced homelessness and hunger, and sadly, even a selfish parent who set a bad model for her and her sister. And yet, despite that, his wife had grown up to be the most tender-hearted, kind, and generous person he had ever encountered in life. Sometimes the gifts that God gives us don't feel like gifts on the surface when we receive them. Sometimes the gifts God gives us can have trauma and suffering involved. And yet God can transform those to become a core part of us in a way that makes us amazingly Christ-like. If you carry the burdens of pain and trauma, God may be able to use that in amazing ways in your life and transform what looks like pain into a talent that can bless others. God has given us everything. We have talents that are more than enough for our lives. The reason God gives us more talents than we need is so we can share with others. With thankful hearts, let us live without fear. Invest our talents in the lives of our church and the lives of others. It'll please God, and it'll allow each one of us to hear in this life and in the fullness of the kingdom, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Amen. I invite you to rise, and together let us confess our faith using the words of the Apostles' Creed.